Hello, Year 9, and welcome to today's lesson, which is the final lesson on the OMO advert, and in fact the final lesson on our first topic of advertising. To start off with, a knowledge retrieval task. Please try and answer these questions without looking back at the advert. Question 1. What main colours are denoted in the OMO advert? Question 2. What do you think these colours connote in the context of the advert? Question 3. What are the two slogans on the advert? And question 4. What do you think these slogans connote? And I'd like you to spend about 5 minutes answering those questions. When you have, move on to the next slide. The main colours denoted in the OMO advert are white primarily, blue mainly in the box in the background, red slightly in the slogans and on the box, green in the woman's top, and yellow in the item of clothing over her shoulder. I think in terms of connotation, remember connotation is a matter of opinion. So we're not saying these are definitely what they connote. These are just my interpretation of them. White connotes purity, freshness, and cleanliness, which would fit into the context of the advert. Red connotes energy and power, which would fit into the way the washing powder is an effective solution. Blue connotes healthy and fresh, which obviously is something you want. And I think it also might possibly connote water, which you need when you're washing clothes. And the yellows and greens, because they're very rich, I think they connote the quality of the washing powder. The implication being that these are the kind of colours you'll get if you use OMO. The two slogans, OMO makes whites bright, OMO adds brightness to whiteness. You could say that whiteness alone won't do as a slogan, although I'm not sure that it is. I mean, possibly whiteness alone won't do. You could argue as a slogan. Certainly you wouldn't lose marks for saying it was. What might these slogans connote? They are active verbs. They are what OMO does. It makes whites bright. It adds brightness. And OMO makes, it uses imperative language. The whites basically cannot help but be bright because of OMO. The capital B makes bright seem like a proper noun, like somehow OMO brightness is something beyond normal brightness. So tick the ones you got right, and of course you might have put other connotations which I didn't think of, which may also be right, so I shall look forward to seeing those. We need to consider the social and cultural contexts of adverts. In particular, we need to think about how the use of media language in the representations reflect the social, historical, and cultural context at the time the advert was produced. Now, OMO is one of your historical products. It is reflexive of a period of time which we don't have any direct experience of. And so we need to understand that when we look at the OMO advert, we're looking at it through two sets of eyes. We're looking at it through the eyes of a modern media studies student and basically a 21st century person, and that does affect how we interpret it. But we also need to understand that we have to understand how the contemporary audience would have seen it, and that will help us understand why the advert is the way it is. We also need to think about how the advert compares to the other two adverts that we've looked at, and we need to think about how the OMO advert, in a way, tells us a little bit about the history and the development of advertising, and if there are any political changes that have played a role in developing the system, the situation that makes this advert feel outdated and unusual. That's what we're going to cover very briefly today. One of the first things to think about is the use of stereotypes in advertising. And this is a really important social context. Now, why do adverts use stereotypes? Do make notes on this while you're going, by the way. So adverts, as we've discussed, I think, are a very quick reference point for advertisers so that they can quickly anchor key messages, because obviously stereotypes work because we recognize them instantly, and particular stereotypes that get used: gender, race, age, because they are very, very immediate and very easy to interpret. And there are others. So a stereotype is obviously an unfair or simplified representation, and adverts use them because they have got a very short amount of time to communicate a message. So they don't have time to undertake a lot of world building. They don't have time to tell you the entire backstory of a character. Therefore, they have to get you, as a member of the audience, to do a lot of that work. And the easy way of doing that is to present you with a stereotype. Say, well, you know what this kind of person is like. Usually the stereotype is not going to be particularly negative unless the advert is trying to stop you from doing something and say, don't be like this person. Usually the stereotype is going to be more positive, and the advert is going to say, well, do be like this person. So thinking about the Omo advert, we've already discussed the stereotype in that advert. What is the stereotype used in the Omo advert? Well, it is obviously that stereotype of the 1950s housewife. And as we've discussed, it is an accurate stereotype. It's not an unfair stereotype particularly, although it is a stereotype which reinforces an unfair situation. And obviously, since that advert was made, the social situation has changed as a result, partly of hegemony and society moving on, partly because of media pressure, partly because of pressure on politicians to change the law to make the situation fairer for women. So that stereotype in the Omo advert was an accurate one for the time, but the situation has changed to the extent that that stereotype is no longer valid. As a little bit of background reading, and you won't be able to click on these from within the video version of this, so you'll have to go on to the assignment or into the PowerPoint or PDF versions. There are a couple of interesting articles about male and female stereotypes, which it is worth reading. Because it does give you a bit of a background to them. So I'd strongly suggest you spend about 5-10 minutes looking at those articles before you move on. So please make sure you've answered those questions and then move on to the next slide. We all have different attitudes to stereotypes, partly because we find different things acceptable, and partly because different stereotypes will have different resonances to us depending on our personal experience. Now, there are two adverts here that caused a lot of offence, and the Fiat one, obviously that is I think a 1970s, 1980s advert. If it were a lady, it would get its bottom pinched. And someone then has graffitied on there, and that is someone's graffitied on there. If this lady was a car, she'd run you down. And that is the advert is basically referring to what was an acceptable practice, which was men pinching women's bottoms. And I appreciate that that is basically something which, if you did it today, you effectively would be charged with a kind of a sexual assault, and it is absolutely insane to think about it. But apparently, it used to be acceptable to do that sort of thing, and you can see that whoever has graffitied that advert clearly didn't find that situation acceptable. And obviously now laws have changed to make it not just morally unacceptable, but actually an offence to do anything to anybody like that which they haven't asked you to do. The Beachbody Ready one, the protein world one, is an interesting one because that's comparatively recent. That's within the last 10 years or so, and it did cause a lot of frustration. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to watch the video. Again, you'll have to click on the link in the assignment or in the PowerPoint to watch the video, and then just note down why that advert caused people offence, and basically how their view of advertising um, made the advert offensive. The way you respond to the OMO advert is going to depend upon your personal situation, and you might respond to the advert in many different ways depending upon the life that you grew up in. Now, when I grew up, generally, my mum did the washing, and that was an acceptable part of what life was like in the 1970s and the 1980s. And very much it was not my dad's responsibility to look after the house, even though both my mum and dad worked. Now, it may be that you've grown up in a home where that isn't the case, or it may be that you've grown up in a home where that is the case. This will affect the way that you look at the OMO advert, the sort of social context of it. So, what I'd like you to be honest about here is how your own opinion has affected the way you respond to the OMO advert. How do you feel about it? Do you feel it's sexist? Do you feel it's wrong? Do you think it's unfair? And why do you personally feel like that? How has your opinion affected your response to the advert? So spend a few minutes noting down your answers to that question. To summarise the context, the OMO advert was accepted at the time because of the social context, which was very much about women having a role as homemakers and housewives. And that depiction of the OMO woman was very much, yes, it's a stereotype, but it is an accurate stereotype of 1950s women. And it's presented without irony, it's presented without judgment, it's presented because that was how society felt that women should behave. However, over the time since then, over the 70 years since then, both the social and political context have changed. Society has changed, and that idea of a woman's place being in the home is no longer the accepted norm. It's no longer the dominant ideology. And the political context have changed because politicians, even though politicians are primarily men, have recognised that the situation is stacked against women, and laws have changed, equality laws have changed to make that situation that we see in the OMO advert less acceptable politically, and women have more protections to allow them to compete with men. The advert then is based from a very different social context when compared to the other adverts we studied. Remember, the Galaxy advert is set in a contemporary period. It's set in the 50s, but it's a very different kind of woman that we're seeing. And so it's not comparable. The Galaxy advert is a modern interpretation of 1950s woman, seen through the lens of a particular kind of woman represented by Audrey Hepburn, and it is not a comparable situation. The NHS advert, of course, is set in the 21st century and demonstrates a real shift in attitude, a far more socially constructionalist perspective than the essentialist perspective that we see in the OMO advert. Basically, the OMO advert does not challenge the role of women. The represent advert it isn't challenging the role of women because there isn't anything to challenge. Because in the context of the NHS advert, it's not gender that's the issue, it's to do with race. Politically, the law has changed the way that women can be depicted, partly because of what is regarded as acceptable representations, that as opposed to sexist and offensive representations, and partly because society has shifted its attitudes about how it is acceptable to treat women, and particularly objectification of women. So the adverts become outdated because society has changed quite a lot. What I'd like to do now is I'd like to spend about 5 minutes just going through the checklist, making sure that you can answer all of those questions, making sure that you can understand if anything on that checklist came up in an exam, that you'd be able to answer the question. If anything there doesn't make sense to you, you need to let me know. You drop me an email and or put a question in the chat, and I will answer it as best as I can. But if you can tick everything off on that checklist, then you are done with the OMO advert, apart from I'm going to ask you to have a go at a couple of essays. And these are exam style essays. So the first one, I'd like to have a go at, there are two questions. I'd like to try and have a go at both of them. The first one should take about 10 minutes. The second one should take about 15. So it depends how much time you've got left. But do try and have a go at one. First question is an 8-mark question. This is an explain question. An AO1, explain how adverts try to sell products. You should refer to the OMO advert. So this is about how adverts work. It's not just about the OMO advert, it's about advertising in general. So you need to think back to the stuff we did about advertising codes and conventions. Now, you should aim for 2 paragraphs in an 8-mark question. You should use the OMO advert for your examples, but you need to refer to the advertising industry as a whole rather. So what I'd say, have a go at your first paragraph, look at the waggle on the next slide, and then have a go at your second paragraph. So have a go at your first paragraph, then look onto the next slide, then read the waggle, then have a go at finish off your essay. So here's my waggle. Adverts sell products using a number of different methods. These include hard sell, soft sell, and a call to action. So what you've got there is my first point, and you've got my use of specific techniques. Most adverts also include a slogan and attractive image. So again, I'm demonstrating an understanding of how adverts work. They're also persuasive techniques. The OMO advert is a typical example of an advert from the 1950s. Although it is quite different to many modern adverts, it includes a lot of features modern audiences might recognize. The second question here is a 12-mark question. This is an analysis question, so this is focused particularly on the adverts. This should take about 15 minutes. How does the OMO advert compare to modern adverts such as the Galaxy advert and represent in its depiction of gender? Refer to codes and conventions as one theory of representation in your answer. So using the PX structure that you've learned in English, your point might be linked to persuasive techniques, so the theory of representation, for example, the dominant readings or the negotiated readings. Examples, you're looking at key moments in the adverts that compare, explain how that representation is being used in the adverts to persuade the audience. Analysis, focus on key moments in the adverts which support your point, and contextual detail. Think of the backgrounds of the adverts and think about how the depiction of gender is the way it is. So before you start that answer, have a look at the next slide where you'll find a waggle. Take a look at that and then have a go at writing your answer. As I should say, it should take about 15 minutes. So to start you off, the OMO advert presents what is to modernise a negative stereotype of a woman. The connotation of both the image and the text suggests that not only is a woman's place in the home, but that she should also enjoy it there. This contrasts significantly with the representation of women in both of the other adverts. In the Galaxy advert, the character played by Audrey Hepburn is clearly in control. It presents a powerful figure who deserves the chocolate treat she eats at the end. In Represent, although the dominant representation of race in both men and women is shown, the fact that the rap is performed by a female and the overwhelming image of successful women in the workplaces, particularly doing things more commonly associated with men, sends a clear message about gender. And so that would be the opening paragraph of my essay. I'll have a go at writing the rest of that essay. Now, on the next couple of slides, there are some more bits of information about the OMO advert, which you might find of interest. When you've finished all of your work, which should include the knowledge retrieval tasks, it'll include your notes about contexts, it'll include your 2 essays, then I'd like you to photograph your work and I'd like you to upload it. Make sure that you've clicked on say on the upload, make sure that then you've clicked on turn in. It's not quite it because I'm going to go through the next couple of slides, but that is it for actually writing stuff down. So with the OMO advert, because advertisers generally use positive images of stereotypes to endorse products, the OMO advert is a stereotype of a happy, hard-working, proud mother, and that's used to appeal to the target audience, which would be housewives, generally also mothers. The positive image is used because it is quickly recognised by the target audience. The domestic working women, in the context of the advert, they will recognise themselves in that advert, and it's a positive representation of a particular kind of woman. And the instant recognition means the advertiser can spend less time setting up the scene because the audience will fill in the blanks themselves. The hope is that this quick recognition will mean the image becomes imprinted on the mind, so the advertiser won't um, won't have to spend a lot of time reminding people of the background to the advert, that they'll immediately jump into it. And through this, the advertiser aims to compel the target audience to buy the product. So the advert, the stereotypical image is the advert wants to communicate as the mother who takes exceptional pride in brilliantly bright whiteness of the washing, and that Omo is what will provide this. So the idea is to compel the target audience to buy Omo because they want to add brightness to whiteness. They want to be like that woman because they recognize and identify with her. They see themselves in her and they want to be like her. Now, at the time, in the 50s, the prevalent attitude judged married women by the quality of the domestic work, and effectively how clean your house was, how good your domestic management was. And so the really strong focus is on high standards of whiteness and clothes washing, this idea of Omo brightness, and all the whites are absolutely brilliant white. And the advert also exploits a kind of insecurity about social attitudes. And they might be reinforced by religion. The 50s was a more religious decade. A far higher proportion of people went to church. There was this idea that cleanliness is next to godliness, so that being clean was almost a kind of religious devotion. Now, many 1950s adverts for personal domestic products like Omo featured an authoritative male voice, which is in the copy of the Omo advert in this case. And the male voice basically tells the virtues of the product to the female listeners. The idea is that you will listen to the voice, and the voice of God, it's called. And it is evident in the Omo advert within the copy, because once we get past the quotation from the woman, we then get into, yes, she's right, which is the voice of God. However, over time, the attitudes to men and women, particularly the feminist movement and equal rights legislation, shifted social attitudes. So this idea of a sort of patronizing patriarchal voice really is no longer acceptable. It's also worth noting that in the 1950s, there was no ASA, so there were far fewer controls over adverts. There wasn't laws preventing adverts from saying and doing what they liked. There really wasn't anything to stop them. So it was okay to exaggerate what your product could do because there was nothing to stop you doing that, and that the Omo advert obviously does that. So this advert has a clear contrast in tone and style to other adverts. It does tell us an awful lot about how values have changed since the 1950s. I hope you found that interesting. Please make sure you've uploaded your work. Please make sure you've turned it in. And then that is it.